Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am David Barrault. I am the editor-in-chief of LUZEAU. I'm replacing a colleague who had to go up to Paris very, very quickly, but don't worry, everything's fine. I have not prepared this round table, but the good thing is that all of the panelists know what we're supposed to be talking about, so that's a good thing. So I have no worries. The theme of our round table is giving a new lease of life to innovation, but I've been advised that we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and how it can be a driver for innovation. As you know, we're all facing all kinds of challenges today, whether we're talking about ecology, economics, society. The question is, are we going to settle all of this by negative growth or by frugality? Or do we need a bit of innovation to help us to get over the problems that we're going to have to cope with? So my answer is yes, and we can stop the discussion right there. But let's try and be a bit more in-depth and intelligent than that. So here we've got Bertrand Jacquiat, who's going to give us a couple of words of introduction. He's from the Cercle des Économistes. We've also got Clara CHAPPAZ, who is in charge of the French tech, working for the French government. And she's continuing the work of Fleur PELLERIN. Fleur PELLERIN today is at the head of a company called Korelya Capital with Korean shareholders. And then next door to Clara, we've got Olivier GIRARD, who's the president of Accenture. Then we've got Gildas Barrère, who is at the head of SEQENS. I think that's the way you pronounce it. It could be SEQENS or SEQENS. It's a not very well-known company, but they do active principles. They create the initial components of chemical things. Then we've also got a representative of Huawei France, and there we have our whole panel. So let's start, for example, by laying out the landscape. I'll invite Bertrand to say a couple of words about the role of innovation in coping with the challenges that face us. Well, to give a new lease of life to innovation, well, one has already been given. 6 or 7 years ago, there were no unicorns in France, i.e. a business with a turnover over 1 billion euros. But since then, in October 2021, there was a big investment scheme which was launched by Emmanuel Macron. Patricia Parabizet, who is very close to the Cercle des Économistes and who is working in another of the sessions here this morning, he has presented the first conclusions of this investment plan. He presented that to Elizabeth Bourne a few days ago. And over these past 5 or 6 years, where the soil was very fertile for young shoots, but since then there are now tens of young companies that have reached, in France of course, that have reached that benchmark, that billion benchmark. A colleague of mine was talking about this disruptive, historical disruption, which has impacted many sectors in luxury, technology, and is going to do it for the post-carbon economy also. So when I was preparing this session, I asked each of the participants to stress, because innovation, yes, it's a very general topic, but I've asked them all to zoom in on what AI can contribute to innovation. And AI requires a lot of resources in terms of calculations, databases, and talent also to exploit all of these resources. France has plenty of trump cards on this front. It's got strengths in terms of its talents. If you look at the ranking of education, France seems to be going down. However, the engineers seem to be bubbling to the top all over the world, including in Silicon Valley, where you seem to find only French people and Indians. There are financial means Risk Capital is in 5th position for the startup of startups in France, behind the States, China, GB, and India. We have strength in terms of energy, because to get all of this running, you need a lot of energy, and thanks to our nuclear program, France will have energy in the long run, which is not expensive. And of course, there are so many opportunities. Let's take the example of a private-public association in the field of healthcare. The sectors where productivity is increasing the most are health and safety and education, and they're weighing down the progress shows. But in the field of healthcare, we can take advantage of France. And AI will give us huge databases for healthcare. There's Doctolib here in France, and health insurance has been centralized. That's one of the problems here in France, but although now it turns into a strength because it means that we have a huge database to improve our healthcare. So those are the few introductory words that I have chosen to give to this roundtable discussion. Well, thank you for that rather optimistic message. Yes, we do have strengths. So, Clara, French techs, if we look back 10 years ago, we were very optimistic. So given the context today, we know that the ecosystem is under stress, but given the specific nature of AI, to what degree in France, when we look at those giants from the English-speaking world, what kind of room remains for a French ecosystem to ensure that we're not lagging behind as we have been in the first and second generations of Internet? Well, optimism is the right word here. I think we have room and the need to create this ecosystem. We are faced with a technological revolution. It's huge in economic terms because most of us, I think, have tried to play around with ChatGPT, and we realize how we can enhance our productivity thanks to that. But here we are facing a huge economic opportunity. Today, we think that artificial intelligence is about 60 billion in terms of the economy, but it'll be 1,300 billion in 3 or 4 years' time. So there's a huge tidal wave opening up for all sectors. So ChatGPT and other productivity tools, but the main usage is in healthcare. We have tools now that can speed up healthcare technologies, and then we've got cars, knowledge, all areas of the economy are impacted. So why am I optimistic? Well, I believe that French tech has been successful over the last decade because, and Fleur will talk about this, I think that's because we have the ingredients for success that we can find in France and in Europe for these new technological evolutions. So there are 3 things. We're going to talk first of all about access to talent, and I'll come back to that, access to funding, supporting and working collectively with the state. And that's what we're aiming for in the French Tech program. We've got a program that I'm going to talk about later on. And there's also a bit of a challenge where we're going to have to speed things up, something which we haven't yet done properly, and that's collaboration between startups and big groups to create all of these opportunities to innovate. So talents to begin with, that's the first chapter. Just as a side story here, the main AI teams and all of the research labs in the States are full of French people. And that speaks volumes. We provide the highest number of AI researchers in Europe. I think about 25% of them are French. The positive thing in this is that we are starting to have a turnaround where those researchers which may have started to do their theses, who in the GAFAM, are coming back to France to work in AI, particularly for generative AI, which is the most interesting in terms of sovereignty. And Arthur Mensch is talked about open AI. We've got Sanders Polu, who's also got a program, and he's already talked about AI. We see there are individuals here who are developing models. They started off in the States, they're coming back now, they get financed here to launch models here in France. And I think that's a real turnaround in the situation. Then the question of funding, private funding. Mr. Alia went to get some funds and got a huge amount of money, but when you know how much it costs to pay for all this calculation with AI, you need a lot of budget, and the budget has to be public. And the President of France has given 1 billion extra euros to be used for these big calculators, because we need more calculation power to develop these models. And private financiers who are keen on innovation. So I think all of the work that has been carried out over the past decade, which gets public money on board. There's a lot of money which is being directed towards disruptive technologies, and there are countries which are supporting huge startups. We've got French funds, which are very attractive. We've got these TIBI funds, which will help startups, and the appeal of international funds as well. We are going to have that financing power, which is absolutely obligatory for these technologies, because it's a long-term project. They're very, very expensive. And it means that we will be able to see giants emerging. So, and now accompanying these startups, we've got some little gems in French Tech 2030. We've got 8 of them working on AI. We know that there are 600 startups working on AI in France, 80% in specific zones, 20% in more fundamental aspects. 8 of those 600 are being assisted today. We're going to help them to grow, to speed up, to have the best public funding possible, because there are quite a few of them. We need to help them there. And over the past 10 years, we've developed a lot of expertise, and we can place that now at the disposal of the startups. And I'm going to finish with a challenge here, because it will be a good subject of discussion. So we want to connect startups with big groups. We cannot compete with big the major players if we don't do something about this. The big groups aren't really joining in the party so far. About 30% of big French groups are using AI, but very few of them have a view on AI models, generative AI models. And so we need that. And if we want to create our own giants, and if we want to have our own sovereignty in this area, well, that gives me a great stepping stone onto the role that artificial intelligence already plays in major groups. Have they taken it on board? Accenture, you address thousands and hundreds of companies around the world, and their millions of employees, so you're at the very heart of this subject. So are the major groups aware? Have they had their moment of that light bulb moment when they realize that AI is so important? And linked to this, you can see a little, or do you note a bit of concern in big groups about AI, and how can we reassure them and get them on board and make sure that they purchase those machines without fearing losing their jobs? Well, thank you very much. Yes, how can big companies, or how are they broaching the subject of AI? I would say there are 3 types of answers, 3 types of transformation. But before that, I want to come back to those difficulties that they have to get into AI. You may already know that these models, the large language models, need to be trained or pre-trained. And that's the most important thing. PT is pre-training. These models have value if they have been pre-trained on a huge amount of data, and that is their main characteristic. There are different drivers, different algorithms and models in the world. One of the key characteristics is the amount of data that was used to train the models. That is the first point that we really have to keep in mind. Second point, if you do not know, and this is one of the hurdles, if you do not know which model your AI has been trained on, you don't know what kind of answers they're going to give. If you've got generic questions, you may be able to do with anything, but if these elements are used for decision-taking in the business, then it's a completely different kettle of fish. You have to know on which environment of data your AI was trained. So that means that businesses have a huge amount of work to carry out before they use these models. They need to train the models because they're going to use more than one model. And data is a new asset. That's what we've been saying for the past 10 years, but people haven't really taken that message on board. It's not an asset in accounting terms, but data has to be an asset and taken care of with governance. It must be audited, quality assessment, etc. It's just the way that you would assess the value of a company. A lot of companies' data is now being taken into consideration. Here we have to understand what it means to create this new category of asset. So if the question is what kind of translations are going to happen driven by generative AI, well, I can see three. The first thing pertains to the entire business. If you look back at the history of technology, if you take a step back, technology has always been focused on the back office, in finance, stocks, we work plants with them. But recently with digital technologies, we've got new apps on our smartphones. But the big difference here is that generative AI can go much further in customer relations, in the interface with clients, in marketing, in content management, creating campaigns, because it can make videos and all kinds of things like that. We can go much further. We can go, and this is perhaps the only tool that enables us to reach this new paradigm, which is very useful commercially for businesses and for clients, and also for frugality. And let me take a sidestep here. We can go into extreme personalization. Generative AI can go very far in personalizing customer relations. And that is a model that a lot of businesses are striving for. So that's the first evolution, back office, including all of the business and its interface with clients. The second subject is, again, the entire business, because in the future, and very, very quickly, we will all have a co-pilot, an assistant in our business life. This is kind of new. We have meetings with clients already where our AI listens to us and writes at the minutes of the meeting, and identify the 8 actions that have to transpire, which you mentioned. And here are the 2 that artificial intelligence, would like to add, given the subjects that I've witnessed. So 100% of your colleagues will have this kind of technology at their disposal. The third point is opposing simple and complex. Over the past 30 years, technology has worked in the back office, and let's recognize that it's also taken care of some more basic tasks. Technology has been working on identifying these repetitive tasks in businesses and leaving what is more tricky to human experts. The difference here is that generative AI can now do those very complicated tasks. And in the past, it wasn't the case. Last week in the insurance world, I saw some models that can understand claims, very tricky claims, complex claims, with all kinds of different complex contracts of insurance, where there's a lot of data. You have to go and check jurisprudence, and in a few hours it can give a decision which many experts would have taken a lot more of time to have come up with. So all of the colleagues will be seeing that line blurring between the simple and the complex. So back office, middle office. Bill Gates has said we are all overestimating the advantages of year 1 of generative AI. We're all underestimating the gains in years 3 and 4 if we have a transformational approach rather than a productive approach, which is a trap we must not fall into. And I believe that today the time has come that there's such disruption in technology that the different leadership functions can be shared out afresh in industry. So just to wrap up, I would say be ready, work hard, think about your data as a new type of asset, and also work with those managers. Where's the data coming from? How confidential is it? Is there a traceability of what you're using? What kind of protection, what kind of rules, what kind of regulations are necessary? The most important thing, to come back to the final question which you mentioned, is this is your colleagues. You have to help all of your colleagues and help them to become an augmented individual. As you've seen in the question, we tend to see jobs which are disappearing over the past 10 years. Since AI, there have been many studies that are showing, and we have to repeat this in all modesty, that there are many jobs that will be destroyed. That's what we've been hearing, but that's not true, because same causes, same reasons. It's because the adoption rate is never what we imagine. There are prerequisites which are very complex. There's regulation in place, and we have to adapt. And I think we should talk more about augmented jobs rather than jobs that are being destroyed. And I will finish off by saying one of the biggest challenges for us in the 21st century is to succeed that marriage of the individual with this technology today. The word that we're using is user. When you have an app, you are a user. I think we need a better word than that, which will better describe that wonderful union between human ingenuity and technology.
Thanks a lot. We will come back to that. Gilda, there are lots of challenges to take up. We have green transition, health-related issues. In France, we have a healthcare system that has managed to collect data so it can be an asset. We have also production, innovation in pharmaceuticals, and the capacity to make these medicines relocation processes, something that we've touched upon, but we still produce drugs, medicines, and active principles, but maybe not enough, but we will be able to produce more. To what extent generative AI-based innovation, to what extent France would be more productive in the field of healthcare? So this is a question that I want to put to you. So good morning to all of you. Thanks a lot. Why am I part and parcel of this panel? We are in a traditional industry. Manufacturing processes. SEQENS is one of the leading companies in the field of development of active principles, paracetamol, but we also focus on the new molecules that will be instrumental in making the drugs of tomorrow. We have an industrial footprint in France. Why? Because we innovate, and versus our competitors, we have research and development that are buoyant, 350 people out of 3,500 people, 10% of the employees working on innovation, research and development, and they are working in the 10 R&D centers focusing on the traditional activities of traditional industries to improve the performances of the process. We are also working on less traditional innovation to help our customers in order to fast-track the development of the molecules. And I will be talking about the new technologies and how they can be applied to our businesses. So for us, innovation is above all a matter of survival. If we don't innovate, if we produce like the American, Asian competitors in Europe, our role is limited. And if we don't invest, if we fail to innovate, our industry will be doomed to lose market share. So for us, there are two challenges to take up. First, challenge to value our innovations, to make the most of our innovations when we design a new product, a new function. When we design a more competitive process, it is immediate. The consumers will buy it. We have a payback. You have immediate profitability. You can invest money. The shareholders will support us. We can launch some significant investments when it comes to designing these new processes and new functions. When we talk about a more sustainable innovation, there are lots of issues. You may have a process that will reduce the carbon footprint of our processes. It is a swift development. Of course, it is fast, but versus what? It's always difficult to gauge. So we need to value the sustainable benefits of innovation. This is one of the key learnings when it comes to giving a boost to innovation. There were different panel discussions in this room, and we talked about the evaluation of environmental footprint as part of the production process. Back to this panel discussion, how a mainstream industry can take on board the disruptive technologies. over the past 10 years, we've digitalized our businesses. I mean, you know what is a production process. The first step was about the digitalization of our processes. We've invested quite a lot. But what is at stake today is AI. But there are other disruptive technologies coming to the fore, and how a mainstream industry takes on board those challenges. Of course, we have to be at the forefront of an ecosystem that will provide us with these technologies. So in the media, people have been talking about AI. We are a mainstream company with mainstream and traditional processes. But we need integrators such as Accenture. We have people who are close to us, but we need to get the support of Accenture in order to help us optimize our processes. What is important is to focus on the real economy. First challenge. Second challenge now. How can we use and tap those new technologies in order to meet the needs and requirements of our customers and to meet the needs and requirements of the people, citizens? So for us, we need to fast-track the development of processes for new molecules, and in so doing, we need to glean data to characterize the molecules, to tie up the characteristics of the molecules. I will have to work with the customers, to characterize the effect of a molecule on the patients, and we need to tap technologies, AI technologies, and we need to reconcile data, and then we can take some positions, significant positions on those markets, and we can bring processes whereby it's possible to improve the efficacy of our drugs and medicines, valuation of innovation first, and then to make the most of the disruptive technologies in order to apply them to our businesses. But these technological disruptive patterns should be implemented. So Minggang, you've been working in France for many years. You speak French fluently. So first a question. So a big Chinese group, why does it need to develop itself in France? In France, you've sold equipment, but you invested in a laboratory, in many startups. You've invested in R&D laboratories. You've invested in production. Is it because we're an innovative country? Why are you enticed and attracted by France? So good morning to all of you. Thank you for putting the question and for raising it. So Huawei is an innovation-driven company, and we've secured a foothold in more than 170 countries and regions. So why in France? What do we do in France? So Huawei has been in France for the past 20 years, and in 2014, we launched the research and development policy in France, 5 research and development centers across different activities. And in 2020, we inaugurated the research center, fundamental research center in France. So I can tell you that we do relate to innovation. We are straddling different activities. So regarding fundamental research, that's important, by the way. Fundamental research has to be linked with innovation. Fundamental basic research is the cornerstone of these innovations. So what about these centers of basic research, fundamental research? So in these centers, we focus on basic fundamental research on mathematics. So we have scientists coming from the world over. They work in France with us, with you, with everybody, in fact. And the upshot of that is that the findings will be shared with the whole scientific community. So this is the cornerstone of innovation, as I said. So we are a telecommunications company, a spare parts manufacturer. So for us, it is of the utmost importance to focus on these new technologies. So we are talking about 5G for mobile technologies. Through innovations, we can make strides with different technologies, mathematics. So that's why we created those centers. So if you consider Huawei and Huawei's strategy, we invest a lot in research, resources, and development. Over the past 10 years, we've invested $140 billion. Last year, we've broken a record. More than 25% of our revenues being invested in research and development. Question, there's a kind of rift, there's a kind of technological divide. The world was very globalized with innovations being shared, but the world is being split up with the Western bloc and the Chinese bloc in the field of innovation. Is why we're confident in the ability of the Chinese ecosystem to work with others and to be a performing ecosystem in the field of artificial intelligence. Do you think that you are still in the race and you can remain in the race? So, as far as we're concerned, we're talking about a split up, a kind of decoupling pattern. But as I said earlier, since 2014, we've been investing in France, in Europe. We have 23 research and development centers in Europe. So we create 15,000 direct jobs and 220,000 indirect jobs. So we create jobs. So it's an ecosystem. I wouldn't say that this ecosystem is a global one, but there's a high technological strategy when we innovate in 5G. There are very few people who know that at Huawei in France, we have a development and mathematics center bringing together 80 researchers working on the different algorithms of 5G, and they cooperate with a Chinese team. So it's a collective endeavor. I mean, we are not fending for ourselves. There is no such thing as China in the one hand and Europe on the other. So we've been investing in France, in Europe, in China, but you are aware of the current situation. It is what it is. But we endeavor to work with everybody in order to maintain this ecosystem. You talked about startups earlier. So you touched upon the unicorns and bicorns, and Huawei has been supporting a digital impulse program. We list 100 startups. We don't invest in those startups, but we provide support to them in order to make a link between the French ecosystem and the ecosystems in China, in Shanghai, in Shenzhen. So you have Huawei, but there are other technological companies working in a collaborative manner. Of course, I hope that we won't reach a kind of extreme situation. We don't want to backtrack because it wouldn't be good. So my phone is ringing. I mean, that's those people, I mean, who don't turn off, I mean, their phones. It may be somebody from Amazon is delivering a product to me. No, Fleur. So before we cast a future-oriented eye, let us talk about the past. So when you were in charge of the startups at the Ministry of Economy, you were tasked with managing the French tech at that time. So can you take stock of the situation? What is your take on that? When you look at the achievements, when you look back into the mirror, maybe you could say that we could have done things differently. Good morning to all of you. So I had a roadmap. I designed my roadmap, had a lot of leeway when it came to designing my blueprint. So you have invention, R&D, and innovation. So you need to be more precise, more specific with those two concepts. An invention is a creation of the human mind, but it won't lead necessarily to an innovation, i.e. with a market, i.e. a new product or an incremental improvement of a product. The difference between innovation and invention means that you market a product that will meet a need, a requirement, targeting specific people. So when I was tasked with managing the digital economy, I looked at different ecosystems, a source of inspiration, Israel and Silicon Valley. So you cannot replicate these ecosystems because they are the result of some specific circumstances that can't be applied with a simple recipe. But these examples were a source of inspiration. So in France, we had lots of ingredients whereby we could create a system supporting innovative performance. But these ingredients were not bound together, so I had to come up with a recipe. So the state, governments, the administration in the field of innovation, in the field of modernity, they are lagging behind. I don't want to level any criticism at someone, but when you deal with an administration, when you deal with tedious bureaucracy, it's very difficult to be in sync with the pace of innovation. So it's very difficult to launch some regulations and then you don't know which incentive systems will perform. So you don't want to have a kind of research that is administered and that can't lead to good results. Some errors were made. From time to time, people think that the government knows better, that the administration knows better, and some public funding is being allotted to some specific stakeholders. It's a bit complex. It might work, but there is no guarantee of success, and I don't think that the state is well placed to know who are the right and relevant players. The European and French strategies are a good example, especially for the cloud. So we bet on stakeholders who haven't proved their worth. Remember, we wanted to create a European Google, but there were no results. In terms of generative AI, you don't have a company that rules the roost, but there are some initiatives that will enable to put France and Europe in the race. So we can change the situation, but when we said that we would create a European Google, it was already too late. So an approach that is too administrative or too administration-driven, and from time to time, government and administrations are self-complacent or are complacent. The Americans, they used subsidies in order to fund DARPA, but the government didn't make any technological choice. And regarding the creation of the French tech, for me, if you create a system that is propitious to innovation, it was a matter of creating a regulatory system in order to boost innovation, the funding of innovation. So it's a matter of changing the mindset. It's not easy because in terms of culture, this is not something that you can state. It was a matter of changing the mindsets. It was a matter of rousing the will of young people to create startups in the field of algorithms in the field of mathematics. So there were lots of ingredients, not a single ingredient. So there were lots of ingredients that were necessary. Regarding the regulatory front, we talked about research and development, innovation. We created an innovation tax credit. We had the research tax credit system in order to attract many companies. I think that Huawei has used this system. It's a powerful system in order to relocate grey matter in France. So with my team, we said, why not extend it to innovation, even though it's a concept that is much more difficult to define from a regulatory viewpoint. So we made a decision. We wanted innovative SMEs to get this tax credit in order to dwindle marketing expenses of an innovative product that will provide some benefits to the users, a product that is more eco-responsible.
And so that requires a regulatory background. You need tax incentives for entrepreneurs who've cashed out, for example, and are going to invest in real estate rather than a startup. These are mechanisms that means that we can orient finance to innovation. So all of these components were regulatory, and I think it was really interesting that we could create an environment that would foster an entrepreneurial mindset. And that, at the time, well, we had a few unicorns. There was BlaBlaCar. There were also some in the telecom sector. But the number, I think there are 25 unicorns today. I think the seed has been sown. The seed was sown back then, and the ecosystem has been taking its time to come to fruition. But what we started back then, in 2010, etc., it's come to fruition today, and we've got a new French innovation system which is prospering now. And in the future, I think we're going to have a lot more success stories, particularly in AI, in regenerative AI. Sorry, I've only just mentioned that term now, generative AI. I think there's not one clear winner today. I think the first to reach the finishing line will have a dominant place in the market. So I think now is the time really to jostle position in the private and the public sector so that we have powerful players in this field. Let's say a couple of words about AI. So the fund which you're representing has invested heavily in France. Are you here to invest in, well, which sectors? In the sector of AI? Is that where you're going to put your money? Or is that a bit too risky for you because the Americans are streets ahead of us? Well, it depends what we're talking about. I've got one fund which is a late-stage investor, companies which are quite mature, which have turnover, which are almost at the profitability point. This is an area which we have studied. It's not really an area, if you like. It's very transversal. And there was Mistral is a company which hadn't even registered yet, but that kind of thing is unthinkable for us, and I regret that it was an American fund that got there first. And the ABP is also present in that ecosystem. There are very few French or European funds in a position to play the game at that level. It's great that it can exist. My fund, it was beyond our budget by far. But yes, of course, we take a very, very close look at all of these opportunities because they are going to be scattered throughout all sectors, and you have to take up a position here or there. So we've got 10 or so minutes left. Perhaps it's time for questions. I've got a general question. We haven't really talked about regulation. In Europe, we often say that we start by regulating before you actually innovate. Are you rather concerned about that discussion about the regulation of AI when you compare to the United States? Olivier, you've put your papers on the table. Do you want to pick up the microphone? Well, I believe that regulation is recognized by the consumer, and the Americans have taken inspiration from our GDPR. We are not going to change our nature, but tech has to be responsible, and responsibility includes regulations. And the example of positive GDPR is useful because I really do believe that it's an opportunity to stand out from the crowd. Clara, perhaps now? Well, yes, there's a lot of work carried out on AI, and it adopts these dynamics which we've been talking about, i.e., and what Fleur was talking about, in order to line up all of the planets in this ecosystem. You have to work together. That's been done very well over the past 10 years. And it's important to understand regulations. So let's think about this at the outset and not halfway down the road, as we can see is happening in the United States. That could be one of our strengths. We have to do it in a way that will not slow innovation down. And we've got Jean-Noël Barrot in our government, who's very dynamic here, wanting to work together, being as close as possible to startups, ecosystems, understanding their needs, and understanding the risks that regulation could pose to their progress in Europe. Gildas. Yeah, in terms of healthcare, we need a lot of regulations because we want medication to be absolutely safe, and they're supposed to treat, not kill. And regulation can be seen as a hurdle, but no, it's absolutely essential. The thing is, how in our innovation projects do we take stock of regulations? Because it has a purpose. The goal there is for your medication to be safe in healthcare. Well, as far as technology is concerned, when you take a look over your shoulder over the past 10 years and how technology has evolved, it's been very, very quick. I believe that, of course, we need to regulate, but we need the proper regulations. You talked earlier on about China and what's going on over there. I believe that regulation should not slow down the dynamics of innovation. It really is important. That's my first point. My second point is that regulation has to be able to keep up with technological evolutions so that it is efficient. So it isn't a hurdle. That's really impossible. Fleur, regulation. This is a very administrative country here, France. Are we going to want to throw all kinds of laws out there? Well, it's quite likely. But I think we could approach things in a different way. The perfect situation would be to have a smart regulation approach. An example is participative funding, for example, which was underdeveloped in France back at the day when I was in position. And there was a lack of regulation that meant that that activity would not prosper because crowdfunding is loans are usually the remit of banks, but here we were trying to get other organizations than banks to be involved. So when we had regulation on crowdfunding in 2013, well, the French businesses were then starting to develop their activities. So this is a very typical example. We've got regulation that can stimulate activity. But in health, I'm not a specialist in healthcare, but I do often meet people who say that the product launch process here in France and in Europe is much lengthier than the United States, perhaps because we're more cautious, but perhaps also because for reasons that could be re-examined. These processes could guarantee safety and the good health of the users, but at the same token, we could speed up the pace of releasing molecules onto the market here in France. So yes, regulation or constraints can handicap our French players, and that is a subject which we really have to pay great attention to because we have tendency to kind of go deeper and deeper into regulations, and once you've done that, you lose all flexibility and all agility. Yes, regulation can be an opportunity. GDPR was very hazy to begin with. Is it positive or negative for European players? Question mark. And there are some regulations which can protect the consumer, and they can be competitive edge. And as for generative AI, there are going to be many challenges ahead in terms of intellectual property ownership and private data, there's going to be a lot of challenges ahead. I'm not leaving. I'm simply going to point my finger at the person who's got the right to ask a question. Please wait for the microphone. Hello, I'm Philippe Cass. I work in Silicon Valley, and I help the European ecosystem to set up in the States. My question pertains to access to data, and as Olivier was saying, it's very, very important. We need data right now to generate these models, which are going to generate value in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time. So today in France, how can we make it possible to have access to data created by the state, or data that is created by businesses, to enable these models to be trained up right now? So is data available now? Olivier? Well, we're thinking all that through right now. The government is starting to make more data about the French population and businesses. More of that data is becoming available. So we're making as much possible as possible because we realize how valuable that data is. It is a work in progress. We are working on it right now. Often I hear people saying that in the field of healthcare, we've got huge competitive edge because we have got this centralized healthcare system. We've got a homogeneous database which can be used, but how are we going to use it? Gildas, have you got anything to say about that? We're at the very beginning of that. This digital healthcare platform will cover the entire French population. All the data will be anonymous. We've got 9 million French people are on the system already for general data and specific data. And we have to succeed that. And everybody has to find a value in that. Businesses who are going to use the data to carry out research, they are finding it very valuable. So this is really a pivotal point. The data is starting to come through. We can work on it because it's all anonymous and protected, but our economic added value really has to help us to change up a gear. So we see data coming to the fore. We see more clients starting to develop personalized molecules, and they are asking us to produce very small quantities that correspond to a certain profile of client. We're only at the very beginning of this, but today action is taking place in the States more than in Europe. And in the States, they have a capacity very quickly to transform an innovation into an industrial phenomenon. We've got time for one question, but it really has to be very short, otherwise we won't have time for the answer. Comme le Conquadi, I'm part of the youth project headed by the Cercle des Économies. I want to talk about the moratorium on AI. You've talked about research. So I'd like to know your opinion on this moratorium that was recently requested. So do we need to press the pause button? I can answer. There's one thing which is interesting, but it's a comment more than anything else. In semiconductors, we're saying that every 18 months, at constant price, the calculating power would double for the very first time in the software world with ChatGPT. When you move between version 3 to version 4, the step is absolutely huge. We are talking about disruptive innovation, and people are getting worried because the impact that we're going to suffer or enjoy, you can pick your verb, it's going to destroy some, because for the very first time it's going to be impacting white-collar jobs, for example. And that is a bit of a cause concern. The second thing is that with Vivatech there were 2 roundtables, one with Elon Musk saying for the very first time in the history of humanity, we are going to be faced with tools that are going to be more intelligent than man. Man is the ruler of the planet now because it's the most intelligent being, but in the future there are going to be machines that are more intelligent than us, so that is a cause for concern. You've got Facebook and Meta saying that we are, what people want to ban us or slow us down, but that's ridiculous. It's if you want to ban the aircraft before really inventing it. So the day that we do manage to create these fast machines, we will have brakes on them, so let's not be too worried about that. And to wrap up, a word of conclusion, let's hand the floor back to Bertrand. economist. So the speakers at this round table echo what Bruno Le Maire was saying yesterday. He really did place the accent on how important it is to have knowledge, science, progress, and I think everybody has echoed those words. My second remark is that perhaps here in French history, we're in a phase of entrepreneurial, innovative capitalism. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the discussions at this event.
Bonjour.
So good morning to all of you. I'm delighted to be with you again on Sunday morning, third day of the Rencontres du Cercle des Économistes in Aix-en-Provence. We'll be talking about a topic, and we were surprised when this topic was on offer to invest in the future. Why do we invest? Because we need to invest in the future. Then I pondered over to invest in the future for whom, what for? What's the point, and how can we invest in the future? And what about the funding? There are two major types of urgencies. A climate emergency. Of course, we'll have to invest in the planet. Otherwise, we will burn. And if we don't invest, there won't be any future. Of course, you need to talk about the French news. Elizabeth Borne, the Prime Minister, is not with us. 7 billion euros worth of investment in the climate project. Who will benefit this bonanza? So this is one of the questions or issues that we can raise to invest in the future. When I thought about it, I said we need to invest in human beings, in skills, competences, in jobs, in training programs. Have a look at what the country went through last week. So when there's work, we need to invest in training, education in schools. These are the two major themes that we'll be touching upon. We have a panel of speakers with us. Fabien Versaveux, who is with me, the CEO of Rakuten France, with Nicolas DUFOURCQ, the Chief Executive Officer of Bpifrance, Thierry, DÉAU, Founding Partner, Chief Executive Officer, MERIDIAM, a long-term investment fund, and Arnaud, AYMÉ, the General Manager at CHAPPAZ. He's been at the helm of CHAPPAZ in France. So at the Cercle des Économistes, we have a local economist, Céline Gimet, at Sciences Po X, and she will lay the foundations of the debate. Thanks a lot, Philippe. So I will give you some contextual elements so that we can kickstart our discussions in the light of the challenges linked to carbon-free production modes, adaptation to climate change, more social justice. We need to invest in the future, and that's a huge task. It's a shock in terms of supplies and offers, and this should span all sectors of the economy. It's like the fourth industrial revolution based on the opportunities brought about by a digital economy with a positive impact on the environment and societies. Some innovation waves will be beefed up, and there will be more productivity gains and hence more long-term growth. But what does it mean, investing in the future? The idea behind that is to embed profitability considerations, environmental externalities, social externalities linked to long-term investments. If you consider this rationale, investing in the future, it's like a philanthropy. The impact will prevail over performance, but in general terms, socially responsible investments do encompass fairer, long-term, sustainable considerations versus the traditional long-term consequences. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the players? As I said, there's a need to invest massively, so all stakeholders and players are concerned, whether public or private. States, first, they have to lay out the framework for innovation. They need to lay the cornerstones for infrastructures, human capital. The objective is to create new technological sectors, but at the same time, they need to support the funding mechanisms for SMEs, very small companies, startups with a high growth potential and with a high risk pattern So on this front, initiatives abound. The investment program for the future in France, but it has to be bolstered. But you have the private players, stakeholders, they have a key role to shoulder. The financial players, banks, funds, and all the rest of it, they need to urge companies to guide their investments towards projects that are fairer, more sustainable. These investments take into account the risks connected with the incoming challenges. This situation will generate more profit. If you look at the financial performance of a traditional investment and an investment in the future, they're almost similar, but investing in the future will be conducive to an extra financial performance, and it should be more attractive. Nevertheless, when you look at the figures, investing in the future is a very heterogeneous process, especially the ESG-related investments managed by professional funds in Europe and in the United States, and they only account for 30% of the overall assets. Why is it the case? Why is it so? Why there's a lack of incentives, and how can we square the circle? So you need to consider the quality of impact. How can we gauge the extra financial performance of an investment in the future? And if you consider these measures, they are a bit murky. Hence, you have ESS washing, greenwashing practices that are coming to the fore. So how can we allot capital better? It's important to pinpoint quantifiable objectives, realistic, taking into account common patterns. The goals of sustainable development engineered by the United Nations, but we need to beef up the institutional, regulatory, tax frameworks in order to make sure that people invest in the future. You have the IRA in the United States. In Europe, you have the carbon tax at the borders. But anyway, it's important to focus on a model based on universal taxonomy, along the lines of the European taxonomy that is in existence in Europe. The objective is to be more transparent, hence more incentives to invest in the future. Thank you for setting the background to our discussions. I'm not quite sure that we'll be able to touch upon all of these topics. Thierry, DÉAU, investing in the future when you are a long-term infrastructure fund, I think that what Céline said is quite relevant. Do you think that the French framework is propitious to investments in the future? You have Bpifrance, we have the Bank of Territories, the Bank of Regions, you have the public actions, you have Europe with some green funds that are being made available, you have the European Investment Bank, you are a private fund. In terms of investing in the planet, how do you choose the investments? How do you establish some priorities? How do you make sure that you need to start launching the process? We have 10 years ahead of us to replace 100 of years of carbon-based production, and we need to move to a carbon-free world. Thanks a lot for raising this question, and thanks a lot for the invitation. There is a threefold approach. We need to invest in the future for financial yields, to invest for extra financial yields. Having an impact on the planet is also very important. So when it comes to impact, you need to have a long-term view. When you invest at a given point in time, you need to focus on the long haul. So this threefold approach is fundamental. So in France, we have all it takes in terms of public money being mobilized. So I think that we can invest, but when it comes to allotting savings, So the financial players and the industrial players who can invest should focus on the long term. Any investment-related action should take into account climate change, but any investment action should be based on adaptation. We are already immersed in climate change, and I think that people have realized adaptation is not easy. It means that today we need to think about different scenarios, +2, +3, +4 degrees, even though we reach the 1.5-degree target in some areas in the world. In some pockets of the world, the temperatures will be higher than that. So we need to preempt the situation. We need to anticipate our investments. And for the industries, there are lots of challenges to take up. We have to invest in the industries of the future, in the green industries, in order to make sure that transition is forthcoming. This is one of the chapters of the green industry agenda, but there's another section that is important. I mean, industry, the current industry should be carbon-free. When you look at the figures, 11,000 sites in Europe producing 50% of emissions, and they are within the quotas. So this is easy, but you have some competition-based tensions, because if you consider those plants, I mean, those plants and factories need to remain competitive. There are some tensions regarding subsidies. We've talked about the American IRA, but Europe has also launched some investment plans. You have a Green Deal, and the Green Deal will underpin those industries, but our storytelling is not good, not as good as the Americans. So we've said 300 billion, 400 billion, 600 billion, and for the Americans it's 300 billion. And I think that we don't think about how all these aspects are integrated into the economy. So we need to turn words into deeds, and that's not easy. Nicolas Dufour, you are well known because you published a novel on reindustrialization, and you delivered a message. So France was suffering from a lack of industrialization. So there's a Green Deal, a draft Green Deal at the French Parliament, but there's still a long way to go. So allow me to flag up this question. Better late than never. So the interest rates were nil. And in the near future, the interest rates will be worth 5 or 6%. So can we catch up at a time when the interest rates are very high? As Thierry pointed out, there is money, even though the interest rates are high, but we might we might be lagging behind because the Americans are ahead. So for the French companies, they will say, am I going to invest in the United States thanks to the IRA, or am I going to invest in Europe? Thanks a lot for this question. So following your question, I need to dispel some fears and some doubts. So the worst for us is to become analysts of powerlessness. So interest rates are high, something that we'll have to live with in many countries of the world, and for many years you have some inflationary pressures. And remember what Cécile said, you cannot change a productive global fabric. There are lots of problems, access to resources, and of course inflation is a reality. So for the European Central Bank, inflation is a key topic. There's another topic, the target yield being requested by the private investors. BPI will be investing 35 billion in the next 5 years, and in climate 35 billion, 12 billion in health care. But it's possible if there are some private counterparts, and have to own up to the fact that regarding reindustrialization, the new industrial facilities that are carbon-free using disruptive technologies, the future is uncertain. It's a hit-and-miss affair because every day you have a new piece of technological information that will dispute the choices that have been made. So basically, it's a very hazy environment. So the private counterparts are not easy to get by. So allow me to make an appeal. We'll need private money. So as Thierry pointed out, for public money, lots of efforts have been made. Public subsidies are quite high because Europe grants 450 billion euros worth of state aids. And there's a blueprint in Europe, the matching process, whereby a European company, as soon as it can prove that the Americans have come up with a subsidy, they can get the same type of subsidy. Of course, you need to take into account the European regulations in terms of state aids, but what about the matching process with China? So what China does is a bit opaque. You have one IRA per Chinese region and per year. So if you have a look at the verticals of the economy, there are some Chinese companies that are subsidized to the tune of 80 or 90%. So we need to prove that. And of course, European companies should be in a position to be competitive. I'm not worried vis-à-vis the United States. I'm rather worried with the level playing field with China, especially if you consider the new economy towards electricity production. And I can tell you that China is a step ahead. So you need to consider the TRI, the yield rate, the industrial yield rate. That is important to take into account. And I can tell you that inflation has risen. So people were humble. So when you had an industrial rate was 15%, it was a sign that investors thought that this 15%, 20% industrial return rate was not too bad, but we won't get the same yields as it was the case in the past. So Arnaud, AYMÉ, so all of these sectors have to embark upon industrial revolution, mobility, transports, transit systems in the next 10 years. If we want to achieve the climate goals, some investments will have to be made. So at SI Partners, what is your strategy? You are talking to different customers. Maybe customers will say, okay, we're going to give up. Good morning to all of you. Things are going well, by the way. And when we talk to companies, corporations we are working with, there's a distinction to be made. You invest in the future, you invest in incremental innovations or disruptive innovations. So the incremental innovations, the companies, can do that, especially with the subsidies, the research tax credit. So with disruptive patterns, you should have a non-diluted investment, and you have to consider the public procurement. And we don't have enough public orders in France. So BPI has been working hard over the past 10 years. And very few people were optimistic in the past. So France cannot invest across all the spectrum. You need to pick up the disruptive innovations. Moreover, it's important not to sprinkle your innovation strategy, and you have to make sure that these technologies are rolled out. And that's where the shoe pinches. Basically, you have some administrative tedious processes. There are lots of absurd standards. So welcome to GMOs, but you need to inform the corporate leaders. They should be made aware of disruptive innovations. We need to optimize research and development, and for the country, we need to establish some priorities. They should be rolled out very swiftly. In Korea, for example, they said, we don't want to be only in the race, but we want to be the leaders in 6G telecommunications, and they pulled out all the stops. But in France, it's very difficult for us to deploy the 5G systems.
So we are going to have to save scientific education here in France. There's a lot of work to be done. Yes, I'm sure we'll be talking about that in our second half. Fabien Versavo, you work for Rakuten, a tech company, mainly tech. Perhaps you could give us a few inroads here. We've talked about the climate, but behind the future, of course, is the future of research. So this disruptive innovation for a business it means taking risks, of course. You're not sure it's going to work. So how is it going to be deployed? And is that not the missing link in the future of the planet? Absolutely, yes. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, innovating for the future is an act of faith. It's an act of faith on the part of society, company leaders. We really need to be optimistic. If you know the language Japanese, the word Rakuten means optimism. So we are the first digital tech company in Japan. We're present in 50 or so countries. And this value of optimism is absolutely basic, fundamental, and it drives us every day. As has already been mentioned, investing in the future or for the future means not only creating economic value, obviously that's essential, but going beyond that and rising to social challenges, environmental challenges, and doing it in an inclusive manner. So to answer your question, I would like first of all to share 3 opportunities that have come to my mind. The first point is a wonderful opportunity. After a period that I would describe as the teen years, digital technologies, artificial intelligence, new connectivities, as have just been mentioned, the cloud, connected objects, and all the rest of it. Well, these technologies are entering into a phase of maturity and are now able to impact the deeper layers of society, the deep layers of the economy. Optimizing energy consumption, protecting the environment, decarbonizing. So these are answers to the pyramid of ages and demographics going down, which is the case all over the world. And that is going to increase, or rather be accentuated. So from that phase where technology was used to connect and create social platforms and e-commerce platforms to digitize financial transactions, now we're shifting to a phase where I believe technology, and I was talking about those deep layers a minute ago, technology will become, AI will become the backbone of society, of the way we are reinventing economics. Just to dwell on that term platform, yes, we are in an age of the platform. There are new technologies that are the foundation on which we can construct economic performance, which combines which includes respect for the environment. So in Europe, as has already been said this morning, in Europe we have to speed up in terms of disruptive innovations, deep tech. We know that we have to learn lessons along the way, and 15 to 20–25% of European deep techs are purchased by American companies, and it's a one-way street. These are the figures that I have at my disposal. So there really is a big challenge here. So we need to root them in Europe so that they can grow and be nurtured in Europe. The second message is that we cannot make up for lost time in some innovation cycles by just placing loads of money on the table. You may be familiar with MSC, the leading microprocessor company in Taiwan. If we want to have a TMSC in Europe, they're exactly the same thing. You can throw all the money at it you like, it will not work. In my mind, investing for the future means fostering these disruptive innovations, identifying the new elements which are going to be in the value chain in the future, and then specializing the European Union in those critical links in that chain, and give us a position, an equal with America or China when we are negotiating. And a third point for investing in the future, which is essential to me, is to invest in partnership with the ecosystems, not investing in technologies that want to disrupt. When I've been to Asia, particularly Japan, I've seen there's a wonderful combination there of an innovation culture in engineering with respect for the long term and equilibrium. In Japan particularly, digital technologies are not there to disrupt. They're not there to hack. Entrepreneurs are not obsessed with substituting their business for something which already exists. What they want to do is to be useful to society. They want to enable the country, the citizens, to adapt to new challenges. One of the main challenges in Japan is town planning and the aging of the population. And in those two areas, robotics. You mentioned South Korea a second ago. Rakuten is the third mobile phone operator in Japan, the third biggest. We launched that activity 3 years ago. We deployed it in record-breaking time. And I mentioned TSMC earlier on, and if we want to create the identical network, well, we gambled on innovation, and we deployed the first network in the world based on open standards, and it's based on the cloud. So you remove 80% of your hardware of a telecoms network, and you transfer all administration, intelligent operational functions into data centers. There are 3,000 data centers scattered across the country, and they are operated by AI. So we take control of the value chain. Well, thank you very much for those explanations. I'm listening to you with fascination here, but there's one word which you did not mention, or no one has mentioned since the beginning. Let's throw it out there to spice up the debate, and this is sovereignty. So perhaps Nicolas or Thierry, perhaps you want to talk about sovereignty. We are being asked to tip into this all-electric world. Perhaps we're not going to be allowed to have gas heaters anymore. We've got heat pumps. We're being asked to adopt solar technology, for example. So how can you move towards a gigafactory? There's one just in Marseille. The first stone has not been laid. But in 2028, perhaps, if it all works, we will have a factory that is creating photovoltaic batteries. Well, they're mainly France, but they are made in France, that's for sure. So, Thierry, Nicolas, so perhaps we haven't got every advantage on our side. It is a wonderful opportunity, of course. But the others are already before we are. We've talked about electric cars. I'm not talking about electric cars here. We discussed that yesterday. And I don't think that which car do I choose? Is it a petrol car or is it a battery car? I don't know if the country's going to have enough raw materials to see that transformation through. Yes, the Asian countries demonstrating the path towards sovereignty. They were not there before, but what's preventing us from doing the same thing? Let's take a look in the mirror and say, yes, it's hard to tell yourself this bitter truth, but we have to say, I am an emerging country. So you're saying France is an emerging country? In terms of technology of the future? Not all of them, but those that you've mentioned, photovoltaic, we are an emerging country, batteries, we're an emerging country. We're lagging behind China in relation to China on many aspects. We are an emerging countries. So if we need to invest, we have they have the transfer of technologies as they used to do to us in the past. And that is, in fact, what we're doing, because when we have these gigafactories for ACC, which is a subsidiary of Stellantis, and Total in Angoulême, and now in Douvrin, all of the machines are Chinese. The instructions for using the machines are in Chinese. So we have a load of Chinese operators for those machines. And gradually we're learning. And that's the way China started with German machines and the instructions in the German language. So we're just going to copy them as they copied us in the past. We have to have the mentality of an emerging country. So the Chinese have grasped this, of course. Let's be clear about this. I respect the youngsters, the young entrepreneurs in China who we heard from yesterday in the afternoon and in the evening. They are amazing entrepreneurs. They're technology literate, they're joyous, and they're optimistic. They're real good fun. And they are supported by their government, and they are certainly at the top of their game. They have understood that if photovoltaic panels were built here in Europe, then Europe would not want to rely on China. So they're already trying to find out how they can cooperate with us to be included in the future game plan. So China is exporting a lot, and things are changeable, malleable, and no battle is lost ahead of time. And there are many things, many areas where it's useless to try and mobilize your capital. We don't need to do that. We do not need certain things. What if we lose Taiwan? Well, there's a factory which is going to be created in Japan, one in the States. Samsung is also doing the same thing. So the geopolitics are going to be different in the future than today. Yes, the world is absolutely tragic. It's a tragedy. So Thierry, DÉAU, are we an emerging country? Are we able to catch up? If we want to make this ecological transition with things that are made in Europe or France, then we're going to have to just roll up our sleeves and get on with these gigafactories. Well, in France, it's really important because we are an emerging country, but in Europe, which is not emerging. So when we're talking about sovereignty, you have to think of two circles. Let's not just be navel-gazing here. Let's think about Europe. We're not always the navel of Europe, because the French imagine that they are the center of the whole world, if not just Europe. But here we've got some very good examples. Let's speak in concrete terms. If we see the ecosystems that are being created in Dunkirk with the gigafactories there, there's a factory, there's a technology, but there's all the things which go around that. A green industry cannot survive without efficient infrastructures that are competitive, and Europe has that competitiveness. We have to continue to invest there. We're talking about energy, logistics. Dunkirk has a port. It's got an electric network. It was created for several nuclear projects, and it can support such a gigafactory. And we're going to have to be able to accommodate 10,000 people. So all of this is part and parcel of the way in which we can consolidate ecosystems to retain our sovereignty. So let's not just look at it in terms of technology. It means that we have to build everything that goes with that to stabilize such factories and anchor them in our regions. Arnaud, AYMÉ, let's investing in men and women and skills for the future. We see that there are some very strong opportunities that are opening up for jobs in the climate, for example, 100,000 in nuclear business, for example. So if the youngsters in France are well educated, they can be a source of hope. But by the same token, does our training system, what is our training system ready to train people? We currently have 35,000 graduates in engineering each year, but we're going to have to really multiply that number. Are we equipped for it? Because we need to do it now. So what is the kind of jolt that France needs to be on a par with what's at stake? Well, just to round off what you've just said, Philippe, you've mentioned innovations, disruptive innovations with technologies which enable us to decarbonize. We've talked about decarbonization for the past 3 days. It's very important, but that's not the only thing that's important in life. There are other disruptive innovations. There's, for example, those that enable us to live better. There's artificial fooding. There's the vaccine revolution, semiconductors. Fabian mentioned those earlier on, and Nicolas talked about these photonic chips that will be able to raise the electronic chips. So there's a whole palette of opportunities to decarbonize. For the France 2030 plan, which covers some of those subjects, and which is driven by the BPI and the CDS, well, it's a great plan, of course, but we need people to actually deploy that plan. So I met DUFOURCQ at the bar the other day, and he said, you've really got to talk with your gut, talk from the gut. So I was trained as an engineer, and so I'm preaching for my parish and for the scientific community. Today, I think that in terms of national education for science, then France is not an emerging country, it's an emerging country. It's a bit of a catastrophe. When you take a look at the PISA rankings of those OECD countries in terms of the level of their students in math, then France is just fallen flat on its face. In 2000, it was in 11th position, and over 15 years, it's been hovering around the 25th place. Today, we are lacking in scientists. There was the MP who was talking the day before yesterday about that, here saying in Germany, there are 20% of students in Germany which are studying science or technology, whereas in France, that's 25% less than that. So in France, we obviously need 3 times more engineers and PhD students than there are today. But for this, we're going to have to attract high school students to scientific subjects, but things aren't looking very good on that score. Bruno Le Maire yesterday was saying that we need to put science at the heart of society. Today, science is not at the heart of society. There is a common kind of foundation of education, and then the 11 hours of literature, French, languages, and also geography and history. There are 2 hours of sports, and in those 2 hours, there's 2 hours of scientific teaching. It's a kind of hodgepodge of math, science, and biology. I think France really needs to, pull itself together. So yes, you really need to give a kick up the backside to the national education system. Yeah, we need to focus on our maths teachers. So we need to give cookery classes at middle school, because you need to be able to read recipes. It's maths because you have to know proportions, and it's physics and chemistry because you have to need the interaction for baking and cooking. It's history and geography. So there's a suggestion I'm putting to you. If we teach children about maths differently, they may be more interested and find more pleasure. Yeah, you have to find the right teachers. And they could also be eating better for less. You ought to have good teachers for that as well. So when you're in high school, you have to give the pupils inspiration, particularly the girls there, because it's very it's gender-driven in France, sadly. We need more energy, so we need to go where there is potential, and there is potential among the girls. So Fabien Versavo, we have hardly talked about AI yet this morning. So it's very anxiogenic. I realize that. People are kind of scared about that, although I'm not scared about AI. People are very frightened about the question of AI. So the question is, does the human being have a future if machines can demonstrate that they are superior. You yourself have experience in the Asiatic world, and you say that AI is galloping there. What's going to happen? Of course, it's going to impact the workplace. That is already the case of those who are using generative AI. And yesterday there was a press conference. You can read this in the newspaper, my newspaper, Le Tribune. Bruno Le Maire said that it will only take 5 years for us to catch up our delay in generative AI. What do you think about that?
As regards risks and dangers associated with generative AI, there's a kind of consensus whereby those risks exist. Of course, the media and the social networks have spawned fears, and they tend to overstep the mark. There's a bit of marketing, so they haven't gauged the right level of risks. So we underestimate our ability to keep control of our destiny. So it's an apocalyptic view, and it won't be forthcoming. If we want AI to emerge fully and reap the benefits in Europe, Europe should set the conditions for regulations that will help innovators. What our minister said is clear. It's an objective and ambitious target. I don't know if it will be achieved. It will depend on the decisions that will be made in the months to come. In Europe, in the United States, there's a kind of a consensus in order to create the conditions for a launch of generative AI. It's important to protect the creators, the rights holders. There's a consensus on that, so we need to go for it. We need to focus on the content, the interactions between AI and a citizen. So this should be well managed, but there are differences in Europe. The European Parliament presented draft legislation. It goes too far because innovation through regulation. I don't think that we've came up with the right approach. We've come up with the right approach. When you want to regulate systemic risks in financial industries, in traditional industries, yes, the Italian boss said when there's an innovation, the Chinese will copy this innovation and the Europeans will regulate the innovation. It's a kind of stereotype. Of course, you need to take into account the forthcoming elections. And people raised the stakes. Instead of creating a legislative framework with lots of details, with lots of detail elements, these are risks that we infer, but let us use the innovators, the methods of startups, and then the legislator will implement a light structure whereby it's possible to control the use cases that emerge. They have to comply with the European values and the fundamental rights of our law. And on a case-by-case basis, the companies that go adrift should be regulated. So this is a project, a draft from the European Parliament. The Commission and the Council will take on that topic, and they will be pragmatic, something that we've seen already in the past with other projects. OpenAI. So OpenAI, they want to open their offices in Europe, certainly in London. There are lots of legal uncertainties, and this may play a part. We are international companies, but we are in Europe with lots of subsidiaries in France. So our companies have to incur compliance-related costs that are colossal, between 15 and 25% of our investment capabilities in technology. The development teams, the data science teams have been working on compliance with standards. We have 10 minutes left. So if you have some questions, don't hesitate, raise your hands. I think that there's a roving mic. So let us start with you. You were the first. So go ahead. Let us adopt a democratic approach. So good morning to all of you. Who you are? Can you introduce yourself? And who are you going to put the question to? Just a question and not a long observation. Jacinda Well, the founder of a company based in Aix-en-Provence, Optimum Tracker. We make solar trackers, and we are using sunflower. We'll put the trackers on the sunflowers. When we created this company, we wanted to create a factory. We work for a future, but we haven't yet invested in the future. I was in China recently, and in China, the level of competitiveness is unprecedented. The Chinese are way ahead of us. Question for Nicolas and Thierry. How can we convince our customers to buy French products and maybe to pay more, 1 or 2, 3% more? Very good question. So I know him very well. So Yassine created his own company, a French entrepreneur, an outstanding French entrepreneur. So lots of ups and downs. So BPI supported Optimum Tracker. Of course, this is a question that could be raised in the drugs industry, not only in the photovoltaic business. So we have to make sure that there's a higher price if you want to relocate, but these are not huge amounts of money in the drugs business. 0.01 cent in terms of price increase if you want to relocate a paracetamol plant to Roussillon. The purchasing center should accept this derisory amount of money, 0.005. So for photovoltaic business, you need to take into account the major players. They want to get the lowest possible prices and rates. And they said recently that they didn't believe in the relocation of a photovoltaic plant. That's not a good idea. We need to relocate plants, photovoltaic plants, to France and Europe. So have a look at the Chinese entrepreneurs. Chinese entrepreneurs have said that they will make and produce photovoltaic panels in Europe, so things will go better. And what about carbon? The carbon project. We support this project, 1.5 billion worth of investments with 3,000 jobs. But what about the private counterpart? It has still to be sought. When we invest, there's a co-investor or 2 co-investors. So, and with credit, we need to rely on a bank. We can't fend for ourselves. We need a private counterpart. Okay, right. Another question. Good morning to all of you. Pierre Abogo. I'm a student at the Higher School of Paris in cognitive science. So I'm part of a movement, Mindsetters movement. A question for Mr. DÉAU. How can we convince private companies to invest in equal opportunities in terms of education and access to funding? A very good question. It's a complex question. I do agree with my colleague, with my neighbor. Education, science education is in a dilapidated condition. There are some exceptions. I'm surprised by the reform of high schools, vocational high schools. Of course, we have engineers, but we will need more foremen, more specialized workers than engineers. But when this reform was done, there were some discussions with the green industry players. So it's important to have an holistic approach instead of allowing the national education doing its own bit. For example, they didn't want to publish the results of the people who graduated. So it's like asking a company not to publish its results, but things have changed. Of course, we have a system based on equal opportunities, but climbing up the career ladder is not easy nonetheless, even though there are some measures that are being drawn up. These are drops in the ocean, but there's an order degree whereby people can get some financial support for preparatory schools. So there should be a better balance between schools in Paris and schools in the provincial cities. So there is an array of measures. Most engineering schools will go to and are going to high schools to canvass potential candidates in high schools. So there are lots of actions. So it's a matter of taking different types of actions. We invest in equality, in equal opportunities with lots of measures. We give grants. We have some support scheme, but we need to scale up. I think that everybody should be involved. So equal opportunities, I mean, this is a topic that is of critical importance. Allow me to chip in. So I will be like a services engineer. So science education is very difficult to reproduce socially. Science, maths, biology, they are taught at schools with teachers much more than soft sciences. Affluent families, they will buy specific maths questions or lessons rather. That's not the case in geography or history. So to boost science and scientific courses, this is very good for equal opportunities. There's nothing better, to say the least. I do concur with what has been said. So schools should be less vertical in terms of know-how. Experimentation should be beefed up. People should be able to innovate scientifically with some autonomy. Of course, more female workers will be able to decrease tensions, and we have to be attractive from an international viewpoint. Europe should be in a position to fetch the best people. So we need to reconcile training programs and the links with schools. I think that the best people in our country shouldn't go elsewhere, shouldn't go to other countries. Another question? I will be shorter. Valérie de la Malazelier, I'm working in the energy business. There's a sector that you haven't touched upon, the war on standards, on technical references, technical repositories. So the Americans, they support the international standards. So there's a decoupling of technologies. In France, we don't want to draft those global repositories. Okay, what do you think of that? Another question, please. Second question. A short question. So I'm working in the renewable energy business with batteries. Mr. DÉAU, you found individual companies. When we are together, it's better. So there should be a virtual approach whereby these companies can work together with their integrated value chains. Otherwise, they will be gobbled up by big companies. Very last question, and then we will provide you with an answer. A question about education. Of course, we can hope that the state can do better, more agile, but civil society companies could invest more. You are very liberals, but you've said that it's up to the state, to chip in. So I will start, and then the financiers will provide an answer. Regarding education, I don't think that a philanthropic approach is necessary. There's not a problem of education to geography, to languages, to history in France. So in France, the problem is science education. The foundations are being supported by the state with a tax regime. Why not give tax incentives for scientific education through projects and scientific training? BPI per sector, what do you think of that? I think there's an elephant in the room. So the social networks have a bad impact on the brains of our children. When I talk to the students in high schools in the suburbs, I ask them, what kind of network do you use? And it changes all the time. 3 months ago, they told me, we are on the social network 30 minutes per hour. When you are 15, 16, or 17, you end up with a mind that is quite confused. It's a source of concerns, and the Chinese are using other networks. The networks are well regulated. You are talking about psychological damage. Bear witness the riots. So when you have an industrial development, it's important to have some means in order to wage a battle on standards in Brussels. So you need to wage a battle on market niches. Otherwise, you will destroy some value at the expense of those who've made some efforts. Regarding the batteries, the operating model of the BBI is based on the entrepreneur. And let's face it, the mystic of the entrepreneur, free, lucky luck, bold, courageous, so the entrepreneur will be supported. Regarding equity, we will help a determined and optimistic person. So what you've said is really interesting, but we need to take into account the coordination costs, governance that is complex, counterparts that are difficult to get by for us investors. So I'm not really optimistic. Thanks a lot, and a big round of applause to them. It was a very insightful debate.
Bonjour, bienvenue pour cette...
So welcome to this session entitled Democratizing a More Accessible Culture. We have Béatrice Desgranges, President and CEO founder of Marcetac, Marie-Cécile Zinzou, President of the Zinzou Foundation for Contemporary Art and Promotion of Culture in Benin. We'll have with us Paul Hermelin, President of Capgemini and President of the Board of the Opera Festival in Aix-en-Provence. Christophe Leribot, President of the Orsay and L'Orangerie Museum. We have Amos Gitaille, architect and filmmaker. So Nathalie Moreau will introduce the topic. Nathalie Moreau is an economist at the Paul Valéry University of Montpellier, specializing in culture economics. Thanks a lot, Oceane. By way of introduction, allow me to thank the Cercle des Économistes for dedicating a panel discussion on culture, and culture can be on a par with the environment, finance, most of the time, culture is the cherry on the cake, but it is not being discussed enough. But culture is a way of having a critical look at the world, and of course culture will reinforce the bonds. Remember, during the lockdown, lots of people started to sing from their windows. People reproduced works of art. It was quite a significant movement in order to enlighten the daily lives of people. And of course, there were lots of artists who were instrumental in this movement. When you look at the figures regarding the cultural practices, the situation is not really positive. Lots of cultural practices have gained ground, especially on music. The Ministry of Culture since 1973 has conducted some surveys on cultural practices, and for music in 1973, only 9% of people aged between 15 and more declared listening to music on a daily basis. The figure today is 57%. So it's a widespread practice, a democratic practice. Of course, you have to consider digital technologies. They contributed to the democratization. If you look at the movies industry, the cinema industry, despite the development of the digital technologies, people like to go to cinema theaters. 50% of French people have declared that they went to a cinema theater. So you could say that 50%, that's quite high. But 40% of French people didn't go to the cinema. And even though it's a kind of democratic practice that is widespread, for other cultural practices and patterns, the figures are not as rosy. Look at exhibitions and museums. Only 30% of French people who declared that they visited a museum or an exhibition. So it means that 70% of French people didn't attend an exhibition. And all cultural practices are connected with tourism. For classic music, the figures are even lower. Only 6% of French people declared that they went to a classic music event, and 80% of French people said that they've never attended an opera. So when you look at these cultural practices, they are connected with entertainment, and heritage-based practices or contemporary works might be less successful. And for the artists, they can question our world, and how can we make sure that heritage-based practice concern everybody. We have a right panel of experts. They will be talking about their different cultural practices, and they will try to diversify their audience. Océane. So, Béatrice Desgranges, you are the president and co-founder of Mars Attack, targeting young people, and this is an ideal for many cultural organizations, democratization of culture, what it's all about, and how does it materialize for Mars Attack. So, just to tell you that the Mars Attack Festival is a festival in Marseille dedicated to electronic aesthetics. You have hip-hop, techno music. It's been in existence for the past 25 years with 45,000 spectators, and it is held at the park Borelli Park with a lot of heritage. So it's a very aesthetic approach geared towards cultural democratization. Regarding democratization of culture, there are 4 drivers that we need to pull. First, programming. How do we make sure that we can arouse the interest of young people? How do we make sure that they will attend and participate in those festivals? We are keeping abreast of the current music trends or musical trends. We've paid heed to the program, the artists that we produce, and we want to make sure that we want to have leading artists together with emerging artists. So it's important to highlight artistic emergence, and this has to do with democratization. So when we target a young audience with hip-hop, today we'll be talking about digital tools. Hip-hop is the kind of music that is being the most listened to between 18 and 25 years of age. So for these events, it's not really difficult to attract this audience. The second driver is economic. You have to take into account prices. The price of the cultural activity will determine the choice of people. And you need to consider that with inflation, it's much more difficult. But for current musics, for hip-hop festivals, the artists want to pocket in. So with live events, these artists can get a lot of their revenues. So there are lots of festivals. So you have to pay the price if you want to see those artists. And then you have to take into account inflationary pressures. So the pricing strategy should be as affordable as possible, as accessible as possible. So at Mars Attack, we have prices 30 euros for 3 days, so 10 euros for 1 day. So we target students, people aged between 18 and 25 years of age, and they don't have a high purchasing power. There's a third driver to consider and to pull. Awareness raising of artistic activities. We have a program called Mars Attack School. So we launch some artistic creative projects, and we fetch artists in high schools, junior high schools, and they will heighten the awareness of young people so that they can prepare a work of art. We fetched artists who will support them when it comes to producing unprecedented work of art, and then they will play on the stage of the festival. So this has to do with the development of the individuals, and we're quite optimistic because we can shape the mindsets of the spectators of the future. There's another driver when we talk about cultural diversity. Of course, we want to have a program that is diverse, international, varied, diversified. It's important to highlight the different forms of cultural expressions, but we want to make sure that we have a large audience as diversified as possible. And this year, we zero in on accessibility to disabled people. In our festivals, we want to make sure that any individual can be welcome and any individual can take part in a show, in a festival. We want to have a democratic approach. The objective is to attract a large audience as wide as possible. These are the 4 points that I wanted to underscore by way of introduction. Marie-Cécile Zinzou, democratization of culture within your organization. What is your take on that? What does it mean? I have a different experience. I grew up in France and could get access to everything, opera, museum, dancing, so I could get access to cultural events, and it was free of charge. And it has been the case when I was at school as part of my personal life, and I decided to go to Benin, and in 2005 I opened a contemporary art museum. Why? Because a museum is a driver for the intellectual construction of young people. And young people, when they only get access to school, they feel powerless. In Benin, the culture is quite rich. There is no doubt about that. But there was no access to a culture. So democratization of culture was very rich, was fruitful. 100 years ago, there are lots of things that were unknown, but after the post-colonial era, the traces of these cultures vanished into thin air. So you had the French colonial heritage and the French culture that was taught at schools, accessible through schools, and the disappearance of our own arts and histories. So the idea behind this foundation was to create a contemporary art museum. So for many people, it was a mistake because it was not a priority in East African countries 18 years ago. So how can we talk to the audience? How can you explain the audience? How can we explain to the audience what is our roles? So you open a foundation, but people will say, what is your role? Why a museum? In Cotonou, the economic capital of museum, there was no structure of this kind. There were 6 structures during the colonial period, dusty structures, and they are being renovated 64 years after colonization. So the question was, in West African countries, will people go to museum and understand the whole process? So we celebrated 3 weeks ago our 18th birthday or anniversary, and we received millions of visitors. So you can get an insight into the enthusiasm. It's part of human nature in Bolivia, in France, in Africa. Parents know that for the construction of the minds of young people, it's important to go to museums. So we decided to make a choice, art, contemporary art. So we decided to talk about the creation of a continent, the creation of a time. Who are we? What does shape us after years of slavery, years of colonization? Who we are? What about this new identity? We are young countries. We will turn 63. but with lots of traditions that have disappeared. So who we are today, there's something that is of interest. People don't know that there's a tradition of a culture democratization in the Dahomey Kingdom, one of the key kingdoms shaping Benin, the Reintroducing, and it's an important element. How can we show the whole population from the 18th century, the national collections, the king collections, the kingly connections, so the king will bring together the whole population, and for 3 or 4 days there are different festivals, different celebrations. You have the show of wealth, you have all of the treasures are being exhibited, the treasures and the artifacts of the court, of the king court are being exhibited. But if there is no enthusiasm, some artifacts will be given to other people, and the next year there are some artifacts that are popular, and then they will be re-exhibited the following year. So this is art dating from the 18th and 19th century. So in fact, this movement is deeply rooted into our culture. So when you open a museum, the first day there were 6 people who heard about the opening of the museum. One person was 7 years of age, and he said it was great because we were telling stories. And then he came back the following day with the whole classroom. At the end of the day, 700 classmates. And we called the schools and we told them that we need to establish a partnership. It's very difficult, to manage 700 children who would be interested in the works of DÉAU. So their parents, they've realized that it was interesting to visit the museums thanks to their children. And then the museum was free of charge. So price is a question. And of course, we are not talking about the entrance. The entrance is free of charge, but mediation is should be free of charge. You need to talk the same language as people. So I've introduced you to an artist, so it's up to you to reciprocate. But at that time, Facebook, YouTube, did not exist. Transportation expenses were free of charge. And remember that the minimum wage was 50 euros. When you have to pay for €1 in order to go to the museum, it's very expensive, 1/10 of the family budget. And there were some cultural practices that did not exist in schools. And it was possible for young people to be immersed in the artistic creative movement. And that's why cultural activities were free of charge. Paul Hermelin, you are working in the field of opera, lyric art. Is lyric art democratized? I will cheat a bit. It's like the teachers of the pupils of the teacher. Most of the time I will go to generative AI and ChatGPT. This is what young people do. We don't have too many young people in the room, but young people, they will turn to ChatGPT and generative AI. So how can we democratize access to culture? I asked ChatGPT, first, education, to highlight cultural and artistic education by taking into account music, dancing classes or courses within the curriculum. Second, subsidies and funding, to increase the public subsidies for organizations. Media libraries should be modernized with a large selection of books, digital books and digital artifacts. Then online access, to develop digital platforms. 5, to cooperate with communities. The community should be involved in the programming, transport and affordability. 7, awareness raising and communication. So ChatGPT is not really stupid when you have a look at that. I will make a personal effort. So what strikes me, if you visited opera is the most expensive, but this is the king of the arts, but it is quite expensive. It's important, I mean, to have some money. If you consider the artists, I mean, the price they're asking to feature is very high. And you have productions at Aix-en-Provence. 36% of the seats are offered to young people with reduced prices, 30 euros for a seat. They would spend 30 euros to go to a Kanye West concert.
Well, it's much more expensive to go and see Kanye West. It's much more expensive than 30 euros. 120 because I went to the concert myself in Bercy in Paris. So opera is tricky. We do stuff, we do all kinds of things. We have agreements with 74 schools in our region here in France. We have trained 3,500 school children in opera. There was a whole program there. All year round, our festival has pedagogical activities in the region. And I want to raise one point. 1 week after those incidents that ensued the death of young Nael, we've got the 14 to 18-year-old. We want to get the 14 to 18-year-olds interested in culture. And you know, as I do, that this generation is the generation TikTok, the zapping generation. Their attention span is very short and has to be constantly refreshed. So an opera which lasts 3.5 hours. Last night we had Così fan tutti in our opera. The first time, people find it too long, and the first time that the curtain closes in between acts, people kind of sneak out because it's just too long. So I think if we want to get culture, people blossoming towards culture, then we have to look at this creating new works. I think we teach children about literature. We need to teach them how to make proper photos, good photos for Instagram. We should teach them how to make short films to put on TikTok, because this is the way the youngsters express themselves. It's no longer describing a play in five acts as Molière and Corneille and Shakespeare used to do. So we need to educate children about creation. That's just my obsession. You've got this planetary challenge, a challenge that all of the youngsters are taking on board, which is the generation, the challenge of their generation is the planetary challenge. And behind this issue, we've got militants who believe they're doing the right thing. They're saying we must stop consuming. Yes, we do consume too much, and we consume throwaway things. And if we want to stop consuming, that means that individuals are going to have to be able to stand out in a different way. People don't want to blend into the crowd. They want to have their personalities recognized. So today I will go to Instagram, and I'll place a photo of an apple in a destination where people want to go. Because what people do nowadays are organizing Instagram journeys. More people die by taking an Instagram photo than in a terrorism attack. There are 378 people who died because they wanted to take a fancy photo of the last 3 years. That's more people who have died at the hands of terrorists. So people want to stand out from the crowd. So let's enable them to do that by them being artistic. We have to really review our school programs so that people learn how to express the individuals who they are, so that they can be recognized through their creative talents. That's what we're trying to do in Aix with our festival. We want to boost people with these Mediterranean instruments, for example, and operatic works. We want to push them out of their comfort zone, get them into hip-hop, electronic music, video games, the metaverse, creation, creativity. Christophe Leribaud, president of the museums, the Orsay and the Orangerie museums. So what have you got to say on this, and how can you implement the democratization of culture? Well, not only according to ChatGPT, we need to get as many people enjoying culture as well. A real challenge for the museums is to decode images. And as we've heard, we will take a lot of pictures. We're surrounded by pictures. We're not always talented in the pictures that we take. It really is important to have places such as museums to understand. There are three fronts. There's the territorial aspect, to have museums, monuments that are available. There's a strong network in France and in Europe. You need to have these economic opportunities also. And here again, for the Orsay Museum, 40% of our visitors come in for free. There's the first Sunday of every month. We have evenings for the youngsters at €10. Youngsters don't pay before they reach the age of 25. If you come with a child as your hostage, the two parents will have a reduced entry price. So we are finding ways of improving that. The second barrier, the second frontier, is psychological. How can we get rid of that barrier? And how can we inspire people to want to come in through the door of a museum? For the Orsay Museum, we have a place which has been built to be very easily accessible. It's in the lobby. The Orsay Museum is at the Orsay station, and it's in connection with the Louvre. All paintings from a certain period are in our museum. All sculptures and paintings from a specific period in time. And so we don't really have a problem filling our museum. There's 3.5 million visitors a year, 1.2 at the Orangerie Museum, which is a smaller wing. The important thing for us is not only to be a tourist attraction. Yes, of course. When I'm a tourist and I'm abroad, I love to go to the Granet Museum here in Aix, for example. But the French youngsters of all age, we want them all to come into our museums and feel at home, to learn. We want it to be pleasant and interesting for them. And that is the real challenge. Fortunately enough, this is one of the effects of COVID, possibly. Instead of, as in the past, having 70% of foreign visitors, we now have 49% of French visitors. So after COVID, the French realized that they missed going to the museum. And so we're doing everything we can to generate the loyalty of these French visitors. So they return to our museums time and time again. And to do that, we have to have good communication to all different segments, but we also have to have a varied schedule of shows. We've got the Cultural Olympics, for example. There are going to be urban sporting events just next door to our museums, and we've used this pitch to have all kinds of innovations. We've got breakdance, we've got hip-hop. And the goal here is to have a common cultural foundation shared by us all. Another lesson we learned from COVID was that in our statistics, over 82% of our visitors come as a family. So there are individual visits. It used to be 35% before COVID, but that has gone down since COVID. So a museum is a place where you go to share with others. You discuss. You can get in a conversation with people around you. So it's a place where you can meet people. So it's no longer segmented. If you look at the social networks, you sit at home in front of your computer or your phone, or you're watching Netflix. But now, you know, we might be going to the cinema a bit more. Now, the museum is an excursion. It's a trip. You go out, and when you're talking about an excursion, that means you go out, you're immersed, and it's encouraging us to look deeper into our scheduled events that we're organising. Amos Gitai, you're a filmmaker. What is your take on this question of democratization of culture?
Okay with you? It's okay? Yeah. Good. I actually want to go to two words which are in the summary of the discussion, which is culture and democracy. Because does culture have any impact on democracy or not? Okay, we are in a tsunami because everybody was speaking about institutional impact, the way of diffusion and so on. but the planet is in a dramatic situation of the recul of democracy everywhere. I mean, in my own country, in Israel, we see what is happening in France. We don't know what will happen. We see a neighboring country, Italy is already fascist. We'll see what will happen in Spain. Finland is turning to the extreme right, so we'll see what will happen in the US. Not talking about Ukraine, Russia, and all of that. So does culture have any impact on democracy? Do we think in these terms about what is, okay, all these wonderful museums, France's fantastic museum, Quai d'Orsay is a beautiful museum, bravo, and all these civic institutions, but what is about the way of life? I mean, you are right that the opera is not a principal activity, but what is how can culture have a civic contribution, you know, without being demagogic, indoctrinary. Unfortunately, we know that not much. Let's look at a very famous painting like Guernica of Picasso, you know. So Picasso is shocked by the bombardment of the Luftwaffe on the Guernica, on a Basque village. And what is his medium? He's a painter, so he's making a painting. Still, Franco won the war, he remained in power for many years, and it did not change the route. And so culture, even from the, let's say, African civilizations, was a way of healing. It was a kind of a guérisseur, the role of the artist, if we take it to the origin. And culture today is becoming a market, so we are very happy with all the statistics that was presented this morning. But does it have a real impact on the shape of the society, on keeping people desiring to have an open society, liberal values, respecting the others and so on? And I think that we have to admit that in this sense, it is a colossal disaster. And so this is, I think, the real question. What is the impact of civic engagement? And there are several models. There is obviously the New Deal of Roosevelt, when the state sent photographers, artists, playwrights to all sorts of corners of the country to communicate also with popular populations, not just the elite. And I think these are the questions that I think that in this emergency moment, not so comfortable in spite of all the achievements, statistics, etc., we have to rethink in a radical way what is the place of culture to promote and to, like you say, to provoke rethinking about the place of culture. Thank you.
Une notion qui traverse.
Yes, one notion which we've heard time and time again is to create for the common good. And if we come back to social networks, do you get the feeling that culture has been fragmented, what with digital tools and the different digital uses? Or do you think there's been a massification of culture in your eyes? And what is the impact of either of those two trends? Who would like to come back on that? I think the digital tools have contributed greatly to rendering artists really famous. Because youngsters today, when they're on the social network, and I come back to what Paul Hermelin said earlier on, yes, they are an Instagram culture. Yes, they do let everyone know where they are, showing others that they're experiencing something absolutely breathtaking. But unlike what has already been said, this is not a solitary practice. You're not on your own behind your computer. No, you're putting it into a network. This is an experience, coming to a festival, coming to a museum. You physically go to the museum, and you often don't go on your own. You go to share experiences with those around you, and then you want to share with the world the experience that you've just had. So in this generation, social networks go beyond communication. Social networks are a way of practicing culture, of engaging in culture, because they can make comments, they can reveal where they are, they can relay information, and that notion of recommendations is so very important. And these are tools that permitting this democratization, or this massification, if you like. Paul? Your question is very tricky. There's a question of the uniformization of culture, and there's also that fragmentation on the other side. So we've got a globalized world which is becoming more uniform, and gradually young French people have got engaged in rap music, and they have a lot of imagination compared to the American rappers. But here, the different musical forms are giving kind of a uniformity in different. So we had seen the commercial music world was making everything uniform, but now we're trying to find some differences. Is it a problem, this globalization of musical forms? The previous person at the head of the festival in opera said that there are these recording studios were very small. There are these studios where you can learn how to do sampling, where you can learn to do DJing with the two turntables and do your scratching and stuff. And to take an example of, I'm not sure about Cotonou, but there was an exhibition which struck me. It was called The Magicians of the Earth. It was a long time ago, 40 years ago or 30 years ago. And it taught us that creating a picture in Africa is not in the form of a painting that you'd hang up and frame it and put it on the wall. No, it could be on a tarpaulin on a truck. These artists were expressing their talents, their imagination, their creativity in these competitions that truck drivers were in to have the most attractive truck in the area. So there's always been adaptation and fragmentation. Human genius is like that. I was talking about Kanye West. He wanted to do an opera, and you can see it on opera. It's called Nabucco Dinosaur. And so the theme was Mesopotamia. And it's not the best opera in the world, let me be frank with you. But it was amazing to see how he would comply with all of the codes. When Kanye West started to look at opera, he became very uncreative. Paul McCartney has written oratoria for Liverpool. You can spend 10 minutes listening to it. He's not being very creative there either, because they are geniuses. Paul McCartney, the Beatles were geniuses, of course, but when they approach opera, for example, they are impressed by it. They kind of bow down before it, and they're curtsying far too low before it. I think creation today is not going to be in hip-hop or things like that today. We need new waves of creativity. Yeah, I'd like to add one thing. Social networks can limit your concentration span, but is this perhaps a direct descendant of the television and the radio, for example, whereas the TV have always been to exhibitions and shown people what it's like, but that's never prevented people to actually physically go. But is this not a straight line with the social networks? And given that, and I'm going to talk about Cotonou here, depending on the context, such as that of Cotonou, where there is a cultural offering which is kind of restricted to private initiatives, which can't cover everything, does that not open a window on the rest of the world? So social networks enable you to see the entire world and to all types of creativity. it can be inspirational, the same way that the radio used to do that. I've got a friend who is a tenor from the Congo and sang at Bastille Opera House. He grew up at Lubumbashi. There, that part of the world, you have no chance of ever being an opera singer because there are no common denominators between where he grew up and the opera. But he heard someone on the radio singing opera. And so once he'd heard that on the radio, he said, that's what I want to do. And he started to sing, and he could imitate exactly what he had heard on the radio. And he worked hard. And then because of all of the miraculous encounters he made, one day he was on the Bastille Opera stage and he could sing there. And what does he do now? He's sharing that on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And there are children back home where he comes from who are listening to him, and he today comes with musicians and instrumentalists, and he's bringing the opera, taking the opera to Umbashi, which was impossible at the time, and it's only possible thanks to Instagram.
And Instagram turns out to be a window on the world. It's an opening process available to everybody, and data is very cheap. So this is the place to be, and everybody will be on an equal footing regarding culture. Christophe Deribaud, the Ninfair at the Orangerie Museum are very successful on social networks. So what do you think of that? Of course, we are using all kinds of means. We are on social networks, we communicate, we share, we arouse envy. So museums used online practices. Our collections were put online. Some concerts were broadcast online. But it's a matter of structure, of defining a framework. People will end up on a site with thousands of conferences, concerts, specific programs for children in all languages. But of course, the process should be accessible, affordable, and understandable. So you can be lost at the Vatican, but you can also be lost on internet sites. We need to target the right people. We want people to rummage through the creative processes, but we want people to liaise with the works of art. We want to share the works of art as part of a common passion. Amos, Jitai, what about that? What do you think? Or maybe questions from the audience? What would you say? Any questions that you would like to put to the speakers? There are some online questions.
Pour commencer avec les questions qui nous ont été... Ah, pardon, monsieur. Là, il y avait une question. Ah oui. Allez-y.
Bonjour.
Sure. I posted a question on the site. I'm Jacques Chillemot. I'm in charge of the Philharmonics of Provence Méditerranée. I'm a conductor. Following what has been said, allow me to chip in. The different speakers on stage are aware of sharing culture to make sure that people feel like going to a concert, going to an opera, going to the theater. And Mr. Hermelin talked about così fan tutte. If young people attend così fan tutte, when the curtain drops, they will leave. It's true, but it's not always true. It depends on the work that is being done upstream. So, ChatGPT, you've described ChatGPT in a very relevant way. You talked about public funding as well at the X-Festival. The festival is largely subsidized, but the structure that I manage is poorly subsidized, and some structures might disappear. I conducted the festival of Aix-en-Provence, but now it's not possible for some people to go to an opera without paying. But today, you have small structures. How can they continue to make a living? I'm here, and I think that we need to work with companies. Education is a pivotal. Education is a driving force. If young children have to draw, if they want to play music, they will be interested in representations, cultural representations at the stadium. I listened to the General of the Orchestra of Paris, and I listened to the Oiseau de Feu conducted by McKelly. So how can we make sure that everybody is aware of what is going on? Something that you mentioned, 80% of people don't go to opera, only 7% of people will go to a concert. How can we reverse the trend with the corporate world? Of course, you have sponsorship. There, you can have concerts, exhibitions within the corporate world. Companies can take part in that process. They can cooperate. There's something to be done. I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm. I know that you want to do a good job, but if nothing happens, some structures will disappear. And we are supported by the Aix-Marseille metropolis, but will it last? But we have less support. We have some social projects with kids, and we are putting all the stops to make sure that the culture becomes a common good. But subsidies have been on the wane, and they will disappear over time. Many structures won't be able to operate. So we need to take that into account. I mean, all the elements that I've described to you. So 2 questions: how can we protect these small structures, and what is the role of the corporate world when it comes to promoting culture? Many things have been said, but we are not going to tell the state. You can't blame the state, and we managed to get a 7% rise in the budget. But if you have a look at inflation, budgets are being curtailed. So the state is still committed to culture. But of course, you have fees, artist fees that have skyrocketed. So you raised a disquieting question. Passion for CSR means that companies are moving away from a culture in order to focus on planet-related issues and social issues. So it's very difficult to get a corporate philanthropy for cultural activities, except if they have an educational connotation. Of course, people want to take up the challenge of a planet. So corporate philanthropy is moving away from cultural institutions. So what is important is to focus on innovation, because there's a social dimension. So with CSR, you have the word social, but I've noticed that corporations and companies have moved away from cultural philanthropy. So people were made familiar with WOZEK. It's not an easy opera, an opera of the 20th century. So you need 1 year to study this opera. So it means that young people should be trained for 1 year in order to understand the opera. There was another question. Yes, good morning. I come from Nice. I work in an association in a neighborhood of a city. I'm with high school students. In terms of success at school, people should be open to culture. I'm quite happy with this session. We are advised to help and support people. with the contemporary tools. Of course, you've talked about hip-hop, but what about the challenges of humanity regarding the opera? So, getting people to the opera, that's a good thing, but if they have to attend a 3-hour opera, it's not possible. But as part of the city policy, there are young people who are ambitious. They work well in junior high schools, in high schools, but they've never set foot in an opera. It's an experience that I witnessed 2 months ago. But you need to ask young people, they want to become architects, and if we help them, they will be able to attend and enjoy a 3-hour opera. It's not a question, just a comment on the role of the corporate world. I'm the chairman of ENGIE, and ENGIE has been cooperating with the MUSEM for 1 year. Though the digital impact is low, but with the MUSEM, there's a coach that will fetch young people in the northern districts, and they will be able to attend some cultural events. And of course, it's a tailor-made process. I'm the president of the Opera Board of Paris, so there's something that has struck me. Have a look at the opera sponsors. We have Chanel, Rolex. You have Patrick, the leader in recycling. Patrick is a significant sponsor. It's a family-controlled company, and from one generation to another, we managed to perpetuate the commitment. Customers, employees can attend those cultural events. Very enlightened. The Paris Opera, that seems to be elitist. So they will head for Guyana with the support with MERIDIAM, managed by Thierry DÉAU. We'll be spending 1 week with our artists. So we'll go to Guyana, a faraway country. We will show them what is dancing, what is opera, what is lyric art. Of course, this does bear witness to a living endeavor. We want to make sure that people can get access to culture. This is something that is pivotal. So it speaks volumes. The commitments of corporate bosses are key. Lots of initiatives were launched by companies when Marseille-Provence was the European capital of culture. In the long term, it's difficult. It requires a lot of energy. It depends on the commitment of the corporate leader when it comes to mobilizing the teams, being open to artistic creation. That's why there are some stumbling blocks. So it's not easy to promote culture, especially from the corporate world. So the partners, the sponsors have a key role to play when it comes to promoting our cultural activities. Just an observation. So I've witnessed the situation in France. I admire what the French state does. In West Africa, we haven't any subsidies. It's impossible to get some funding for culture, so I cannot be with my colleagues in theaters, in operas. There is no financial commitment whatsoever. There's a new law that has been enacted in order to get a tax-free rate. So what is happening in France is exceptional. So you are quite fortunate, and from Benin, I admire France because culture is right and not a luxury. So I will give the floor to Nathalie. I will summarize the debate. So regarding culture, culture is synonymous with enjoyment, pleasure. And with culture, we can have a critical look at society. Amos Guitaï has talked about the importance of culture at a time when democracies are being challenged. Having a critical look means that we need to look at ChatGPT. So with culture, we can embody values. So we talked about ChatGPT, the definition of ChatGPT. Cultural embodiment is important. The role of education is key in Africa. Some bonds were forged with schools. There are potent links with education. The issue of pricing is key. The use of social networks is important. Social networks should be a tool, and they shouldn't prevail over culture. And what about the funding model of culture? It was not supposed to be a topic of this panel discussion. When you talk about culture, you need to talk about culture funding, the role of a state. What do we finance? As Amos Guitaï said, if the public authorities decide to finance culture, what about the cultural assets? Who will be managing them? There are some cultural practices that are more important to finance, but which ones? But I think that these topics should be given further consideration next year. Thanks a lot.